Really happy to have Dr. Anson Ma as our seminar speaker. I think we kind of going back to our roots, which is, focusing on additive. It's been a while since we had the last additive talk. So that's great to have Anson. And Anson today is going to be talking about additive and 3D printing of functional materials from electronics to edible products. And that's kind of cool because right after this class, we're going to have our lunch break, Anson, after the seminar. So hopefully you have some good looking pictures of 3D printed edible products. Quickly, Anson's an associate professor of chemical engineering and polymer science at the University of Connecticut. He actually, the way I got in touch with him was, he's a UConn site director of the National Science Foundation called Shape 3D for additive manufacturing. It's an IUCRC and he heads it at UConn. He's got a lot of awards, as if you had the chance to read through the abstract. He has the NSF Career Award, an Early Career Award from the Society of Rheology, awards from 3M, from TA, from American Association of University Professors, and also the UConn Polymer Programs Directors Award. So we're really thrilled to have you, Anson, and the floor is all yours. And I'll stop my video, and I hope everyone mute yourselves too. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Krishna, for the introduction. Let me go to the next one. So, Krishna just gave a brief my background, and this is kind of showing where I was for the last 2 decades, I would say. And then, but what is not on my bio sketch is like a little bit more personal note. So when I was in Texas doing my postdoc at Rice, I actually adopted a cat. And then since then I moved to UConn, and I have a golden retriever and a German shepherd. You may hear them barking in the background. So I hope you will excuse me. And my daughter just turned 1 year old this week. So, so again, you may hear some baby crying in the background. So, excuse me for that. As Krishna mentioned, I would like to just, briefly also mention the Shape 3D Center. Right now, the Shape 3D Center is a partnership between UConn, UMass Lowell, and Georgia Tech. It's an industry university cooperative research center. So NSF is putting in some federal funds, and then together with money that we brought in from industry and government labs. So we have like Sandia, for example, Air Force Research Lab, US Army, there's the Picatinny site, as well as the NATIC site. They're also members. And then the idea is to kind of build an ecosystem on additive manufacturing. We focus primarily on soft materials, but definitely we would also like to work with people who work in metal, and also the interface between soft materials and metal materials. So this has been going on for the 4 years, and we're looking forward to adding more university sites. And this is also the mandate from the NSF program director. So I just want to briefly mention that. And then now if I zoom in and look at my group, so we did not manage to take any group photos. So it's kind of like virtual, and then you can see people with the headset and everything. And then back then I had my COVID haircut, which means that didn't have a haircut for a long time. And my group at UConn, we focus on complex fluids, or in other words, rheology, and also as well as the printing and the processing. And then the past, I would say 5 to 10 years, we have been primarily working on 3D printing. And these are some of the sponsors, and without the sponsorship, it's, nothing is possible, because we, need to be able to support our students in this journey. And if you look at some of the expertise in our group, and also areas that we're interested in, we're definitely interested in rheology and surface science. And there's some interface between the rheology and surface science that has to do with like how to, engineer more stable emulsions and so on and so forth. We work a lot with Unilever, which is one of the leading personal care companies. And then also in Connecticut, we work with aerospace companies, and more specifically, we have been working on some thermoset characterization for making composite materials. But today's talk, I'm going to focus on the 3D printing. And we have a very strong collaboration with a colleague in computer science and engineering. And I'll also explain a little bit why that we're working together, because they're very good at writing and doing algorithms. And in terms of 3D printing, you can see here in this map, there's also some overlap with rheology. And hopefully, by telling a few stories and a few lessons that we learned through the exploration of 3D printing, then hopefully I can convince you by the end of the talk that rheology is very important for, successfully printing materials, and also like so as the surface tension, contact angle, and things like that, that are very important. In terms of application space for 3D printing or additive manufacturing in general, over the years, we have dabbled in printing polymer composites. There are different ways to do that. I'll briefly touch on that today. Then we, driven by the needs from the aerospace industry and more specifically Raytheon Technologies, like we start looking into all these different types of sensors that you can additively print. From wear sensors to temperature detectors to even magnets that we can 3D print using different methods. And then working with colleagues in biomedical engineering and also our medical school, UConn Health, we have been toying with the idea of printing different biomaterials so that you can use it for disease models, or you can think about regenerative medicine applications. Since in today's talk, I mentioned editable products in the abstract, so we definitely are going to touch on drug tablets. And also the last topic I'm going to touch on is food. So Krishna mentioned that, you guys are going to have lunch after this, right? So hopefully I'll make you hungrier than before. So let me first talk about carbon nanocomposites printing. This is very early work that we start. I think this work started because at that time, there's a company called MakerBot. And I think after the patent from Stratus is expired, they actually have more companies doing this kind of low-cost printers. And at that time, you can buy a printer at a relatively low cost. And then for research, it's really, a few $100s is not a lot for an instrument, right? So then we start with that like everyone else. And then the way that this printing method works is called fused filament fabrication or fused deposition modeling. The way it works is you can imagine that you have a hot glue gun. So in the back end, you feed a polymer filament, usually it's thermoplastic material. And then there's a pinch roller mechanism that is kind of spring loaded, and then you can push your filament into a chamber. And then this chamber, you heat up the material so that your material melts. And then you kind of like use the filament in the back to push the material that has been liquefied. And then after that, you push it through a nozzle, and then you start depositing. So the way I describe it, and to remember this, is kind of like a glorified hot glue gun approach, right? So you take a hot glue gun and you mount it on a gantry system. There you go, you have a printer. So in terms of cost-wise, it's not that much, but I mean, to do it very well, then it costs money, and to maintain all this temperature gradient and so on and so forth, there's a lot of know-how, and also formulate the right polymers to be able to use these kind of printers. So back then, our curiosity was to incorporate some kind of fillers. When I was at Rice, I picked up a lot of work in carbon nanotubes. So like I had a bag of carbon nanotubes sitting in my office, and at that time my student was just curious, and I said, okay, why don't you take the carbon nanotubes and do some 3D printing? So that's what we did. I think the key message here is that like if you do this kind of printing, you can characterize the rheology of the material. So this material is a shear thinning material. So meaning that if you look at the viscosity as a function of shear rate, they kind of decrease as a function of increasing shear rate. And in terms of the microstructure, depending on how you print the material. So let's say if you have a nozzle here and you're pushing the material that is in a liquid state, and there's a certain gap. So there's a certain gap here, there's a certain width that you're printing, and then you're dragging this nozzle at a particular velocity using the gantry system. And depending on the balance between how big a gap that you have, how fast you're restoring the nozzle, and how much material you're pushing out, then you can define a dimensionless group. I'm a chemical engineer by training, so I love dimensionless groups. So here I have Q actual. Q actual is the actual volumetric flow rate of the materials that is driven by how fast I'm pushing the material from the back end using a pinch roller mechanism. And then the Q ideal is like, what would be the volume here if I just fill the gap? between the nozzle and the substrate, and then and also have a certain width. So by calculating this, you can think of this as a flow index, almost like if the QR here is small, that means you have a lot of gaps in between the lines that you're printing. And then if you have a very high QR, then if you have filler systems, it actually mess up the orientation of the feelers. So this is kind of like an early work that we did, and then we published this in Polymer Composites. So that was, you know, very low entry barrier. You know, everyone can do that kind of project. Then we kind of say, okay, can we do something fancier and do things like more intricate, for example, like this kind of lattice structures. What you're seeing here on the right-hand side, the black layers are actually materials filled with carbon nanotubes. And then in between, you can see like, you know, this lattice structures where, you know, the more translucent layers, those are just the neat resin. So in here, what we did, was this is a printer that we put together, and it was work supported by the Shape 3D Center. It's called multi-material digital light processing method. So I will play this video and I'll explain as we go. Hopefully it will cooperate. So as you can see here, there's two syringes. Let's say the clear syringe here, the material will be the translucent layer for making that layer, and then the black material will be infused with nanotubes, and then we will dispense this onto a translation stage. So you can see we're creating two puddles. So one puddle with just the neat resin, and then it's a photo resin, and then the other is infused with nanotubes. And here you can see the stage kind of moves down. So this is the build plate. And then there's a projector from below. So what happened is now I'm projecting a pattern onto that layer, and then I'm doing the photo cross-linking for that layer. And then after that, I move out the stage. And you see there's a tiny metal piece here. Actually, this is an edge system that is to blow away the excess material. And then after that, now we can, after removing the excess material as much as we can, and then we will dip it into a second puddle, which is with a different material. And by doing this repeatedly, you can actually create structures that are lattice structures, and you can also have two materials being made, you know, in the same printer. So as I mentioned here, I have layers of clear and then black, and then here is demonstrating that you can also do the two materials laterally, meaning that for the same layer, the middle could be one material, and then the side could be made with another material. And this was work that was done by Kevin and Sally and Xinyun. And Sally actually, she was a postdoc who was working on this project, and then she got a faculty position at UConn. And then now she's just across the street from my office. And then she actually continues to do more work using this platform for making sensors and other wonderful things as part of the Shape 3D project with Georgia Tech and UMass. So, and I kind of like try to be as hands-off as possible. Now, in addition to polymer composites, we can also think about printing sensors, as I mentioned, and this is really driven by the needs to for the, you know, to serve the aerospace industry, especially in Connecticut. We have the whole supply chain because of used to be United Technologies, now it's Raytheon Technologies. So this was work supported by them. And Alan was the PhD student who actually worked on this project. What we have here is also like an extrusion-based method, which is similar to the FFF or fused deposition modeling or fused filament fabrication technique, except that like you use a gas pressure on the back end. So imagine that you have some gas pressure here, and then you have like the ink. And then to control the printing, this is called direct ink writing. So what we have is this rod here that is going to move up and down, and there's O-rings that's sealed off. So essentially by moving this rod up and down, then we can control the dispensing of the material. So this is a pneumatic drive, but then to control, instead of messing with the pressure, there's more transient involved. We actually use the valve to on and off to deliver the material. And by doing the printing of the material, we can create like sensors. So this is all like printed. And you may want to ask, like, why do you want to print it, right? One nice thing about the printing is that you can directly deposit the sensors or detectors onto the parts that you're manufacturing. So then that eliminates the need to first print on a substrate and try to wait to attach it. So that would reduce weight, right? And then you can have it very fully integrated with whatever components that you're using. But of course, we'll also check, the performance of this versus commercial thermocouple. And you can see that in terms of the temperature response and all this, it's very comparable with the commercial, except that now you can do it on different conformal surfaces. It doesn't have to be flat. It could be, the sensor could be directly onto something with a topology. And then we'll also check the repeatability and all that. And this work was published in IEEE. Now, since I talk about the importance of rheology, so I would like to convince you, and hopefully by the end of this talk, you will appreciate that rheology is important. So now let's say if you have a new project and then someone asks you to do some printing using, the direct ink writing method that I just described on the previous slide. And then you have different options of inks, right? How do you know which ink is good? So, and certain inks actually, unfortunately, because of the use of metallic particles and stuff like that, they tend to settle, and depending on how well you formulate that, they may aggregate and settle, right? So one trick that you can do is you can run a rheology test. So you can, for example, what we call is flow curve here. So you can measure the apparent viscosity as a function of shear rate. So you can also check over time whether or not there's a deviation in the viscosity profile, right? For example, like if the sample particles start settling, then every time when you sample from the top, you can see actually over time the viscosity drift, and it actually becomes less and less viscous just because the particles are settling and you're collecting the sample from the top. And there's also another ink that we look at. Actually, you don't worry too much about that, at least for 15 days. So you don't have to worry about that. You get the ink and it will print within that time frame, then it should be fine. So rheology is a good way to fingerprint that before you load it to the printer and realize that thing doesn't work, right? Another way to make it work, if it does settle, then is to kind of remix it. So you can throw it in a speed mixer or something to remix it before use. But this is helping you to identify like how long a workable window I have for the material. And then the other test that we use and develop as test protocol for is called thixotropy. So I think this is something that is quite well known in the paint industry as well. So let's say if you have an engineer or if you're a grad student, you go to the lab, right? I'm printing all this wonderful, I got this wonderful ink that I'm printing. And then over the weekend, I may be taking a break, right? Or maybe Christmas break or something like that. And then I come back and realize the ink is not printing anymore. So that has to do with, like, if you think about the ink, usually it contains particulate materials and some kind of microstructures to it. And when you shear the material, you modify the structure. But after you shear the material, let's say if you let it sit again, then the viscosity could recover. And sometimes the viscosity could be even higher than your starting point. So in that case, then you would say, well, what is going on, right? So this is a test method that you can use. It's one of the ways to do thixotropy tests. So what you do is you apply very small oscillation, then you kind of like, measure the complex modulus of the material. And then after that, you apply a steady shear, meaning that you keep turning. So you try to mimic the shear process that is induced during the printing process. And after that, you switch back to this small oscillation just to probe how the viscosity or how the modulus of the materials evolves as a function of time. By doing this test with two different inks, for example, here, this is ink, a certain ink, it has very good reproducibility. And then in the actual print experiments, we'll also confirm that. And then the other ink you can see is all over the place. When you do it like 3 times, it's all over the place, then that's also an indicator of a problematic ink. And then we actually, back then, we did this experiments, and we actually transferred some of this test method protocol to Boeing so that they can do their own rheology tests on this. As I promised you before, and also I highlighted before, in addition to rheology, surface science, or the contact angle is also very important. So let's say if you are looking for a very good, high resolution print, how the ink wets the substrate matters. So if you have an ink wetting the substrate, if you have 2 cases, for example, here, you see in one case, ink C is a very nice hemisphere. because you have surface tension, right? And then that, this ink is trying to make a contact angle with the substrate. Depending on how you clean the substrate, that, the contact angle could vary. That's key point number one. Key point number two is that, like, in some inks, actually, if you want to have very high resolution print, your actual ink D would be better, because you see this is all irregular shape, but then the fact that it's irregular because the viscosity, or there could even be some yield stress, is so high that when you deposit the material, it's not going to spread, right? So you can see the contact area is much smaller than the other ink C. So doing this kind of contact angle, again, just to, as a pre-screening, if you have a lot of options in terms of inks that you want to work with, or inks that you formulate in your own lab that you want to at least get a sense before you set up the whole printer and waste all kind of materials, I always suggest you to run some rheology tests and also some contact angle measurements that at least give you a pretty much good sense of how well this ink is going to behave when you do this kind of direct ink writing. And then back then also my former postdoc, Lena, she did some simulations. And again, you can also run some simulations, try to understand how the ink rheology would impact, the footprint of the line, and also like how the processing conditions, like how fast you're dragging the nozzle and how fast you're pumping the material would influence the print line resolution. And then, so this is kind of also the student kind of carry on that work. And this is the tool that we use, for the direct ink writing. And then you can do different rheology measurements for the materials. These are some of these commercial materials, and some are we took the commercial material and do some modification to it. This work has already been published, but the idea back then is to create very high resolution lines. So it comes back to this rheology curve again. So this is apparent viscosity versus shear rate. All this material shear thins. Again, the viscosity decreases as a function of increasing shear rate. And in this kind of printing, usually this is perceived to be a good thing, because when you're pushing on the ink material, actually the viscosity drops, right? So it doesn't take a lot of energy or pressure to drive out your material. So that's a good thing. But once the material is deposited onto the substrate, the viscosity goes up, because on the substrate, you're not really actively shearing the material. So in that case, you'll be more looking at a low shear or even zero shear kind of viscosity. So the higher the merrier, right? So in other words, like in shear thinning, usually it's advantages for this type of printing, because during the pumping or pressure action, then you bring down the viscosity, but as soon as the material is deposited on the substrate, the shear rate diminishes, meaning that you're moving in this direction in a viscosity plot, and then the viscosity goes up. So then you kind of maintain the shape fidelity of whatever you just printed. So in general, is a good thing. The only caveat to this is the higher the degree of shear thinning, meaning that the steeper the slope here, then you have to have also tighter control in terms of the pressure. Because as you can imagine, like if I have a lot of fluctuation, right? If I'm in a very old building at a university that has very crappy compressed gas supply, then you will have a lot of variation in pressure. And as you perturbate in the shear rate, because the pressure is going to also affect the flow rate, and the flow rate determines the shear rates. And then you also will have much bigger, results in the viscosity change. So the only caveat that I would say is that, the higher the degree of shear thinning, the better, but it also put more constraint or considerations like on the pressure control, how well you can control the pressure. But if you're in a new building with very nice compressor, that shouldn't be a big problem. But back then, by doing the rheology and also the different print experiments, the key thing here is we managed to get down to very thin lines. So we're talking about 15 microns. And just to give you a sense, your hair diameter is about 100 microns. So this is an order of magnitude smaller. And then also the line-to-line spacing is very, very small. Now, you may ask, why the heck you want to have high resolution, printing? So this is the justification for that. So this is a wet sensor. So we did not design this. So this was done by our partner, Raytheon Technologies. And so you can see a bunch of lines here. It looks as if they all merged together, but they're not. So what happened is, imagine this thing is embedded inside coating. As the coating evolves, that it cuts through all these lines. It's going to break the circuit, some of the circuitry. And then as it breaks, it actually sends off a voltage. So by having all these lines as close as possible, then you will have a very high resolution wear sensor. Again, it comes from the fact that, as the material wears off, then you can see like, a change in the voltage. So the smaller the line spacing that you can do, meaning that there's more higher sensitivity that you have for your wear sensor. So that time, that's why we want to kind of minimize the line width and also the line-to-line spacing for this sensor. And then the trick has to do with the rheology. And again, you're seeing a lot of this rheology plots. Probably you will dream about this tonight. And so again, this is a slightly different process. So we work on some sensors, and then then there was a kind of another project from Raytheon Technologies. They were interested in printing magnets. So that's pretty cool. Like I never thought about that. And so what we print specifically is polymer bonded magnets. That means it's a composite material. So you have the magnetic particles, but like it's sitting in a photopolymer that has been cross-linked. And what we do is this direct ink writing process. And I'm going to play the video. I think it's better to show you the video. And so here you see the needle. What we're dispensing is some kind of magnetic particles in the photopolymer. And after we print each layer, then we have the UV that comes and cross-link the material. So you see now there's a bright spot. This is the curing process. So we keep on doing that, and we can create magnets with arbitrary shapes now. And then if you look at a comparison with other work by additive manufacturing in the literature, we're doing pretty good. So let me explain here. So the x-axis is coercitivity. So it has to do with, let's say, once you have the magnet and then you magnetize it, and after that, this is how high field that you apply so that you will, zero out the magnetic field of that magnet. So the higher, that means is more resistant against this external magnetic field in the opposite direction. And then for the remnants, essentially is after you magnetize the magnet, like how much magnetic field that can be generated with these magnets. So the upper, as you go in this corner, the upper right corner, the higher you go, then the stronger the magnet is. So so that this is kind of the direction that we want to head to. And we will also come back to this on the next slide. But these are different methods like injection molding, and this is a big area, additive manufacturing. This is selective laser sintering, binder jetting, direct ink writing. But we're doing pretty good with this method. And we call this UV assisted direct write because we combine the direct ink writing process with a UV curing. And then to make sure that we have good shape fidelity for each layer after we print, then we kind of look at rheology. And also we combine this with UV. So that's the angle of this work that we did. Now, the sponsor was happy after we published that paper. He said, yay, you're doing pretty good, but can we do even better? So can we move in this direction even further? So, and then the answer is yes, but then that got us right into trouble because one way to improve the performance of those polymer magnets that we 3D print is to use a different source of magnetic particles. So the one that we were using before on the previous slide, they were made with the atomization process. And then the sponsor said, hey, we have some good stuff that is based on mouse spinning. Now, if you look at the particle morphology, they're much more jagged, right? So it's more irregular shaped. And then if you look at the viscosity, actually is when you disperse it the same volume fraction in the resin, in the photopolymer, actually it's 100 times more viscous. So then we have big trouble in printing that stuff. So then what do we do? So it goes back to actually some work done in the 70s, long time ago, when people look at suspension rheology. One thing they realized that, it's not just what's the volume fraction of particles you put in there, but the particle size distribution also matters. So what they do is like, if you think of like, you have big particles, let's say, if you have a bimodal particle system, you have big particles and you have small particles. Now, by manipulating the particle size ratio between the big and the small particles, and also by manipulating how many big particles relative to the small particles, you can actually find a sweet spot. Because you can think of this is kind of like a space filling exercise, right? So you have the big particles, but in between the big particles, you have tiny space. But if you have tiny, smaller particles that will fit in that space, you can pack more, right? So by doing that, you can push up the particle volume fraction without jumping up the viscosity as much. So this is what we did. So we went back to, got the inspirations from the 70s and 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and then we play this game of particle size distribution. And by doing that, we identified a certain particle size ratio and particle volume fraction based on the large to small particle ratio. Then we find a spot where it will give us lowest viscosity. And then we went ahead and then kind of like prepare that suspension and then use the same UV assisted printing. And then we managed to push out this from the previous case to, higher this direction. So that is again, to hopefully to convince you that the rheology is important, and also understanding some of the stuff like that you learn in your rheology class may be important, right? Back in the 70s, people already know this, but then they did at the time they didn't worry about 3D printing, right? Now we worry about 3D printing, but this is kind of like good old tricks that from the 70s would still work beautifully these days with the newer print technology and research. Now I'm going to switch gear to talk about another print method, which is called binder jet printing. So let me take the time to explain what it is. So the previous cases, we have this case where, extrusion based, right? So we squeeze out a material, we can do UV curing, for example, but this is a fundamentally different technology. This is based on inkjet technologies. Inkjet, again, has been around for a long time, since the 70s. Traditionally, it's being used to make barcodes and graphic printing. So you may have one of those home use inkjet printers sitting at home. Obviously, there's some annoying thing about those, right? If you don't use it for a long time, then it gets the nozzles clog up and all those issues. That we sometimes also have that similar issues, even for those customized for 3D printing. Anyway, so what binder jet is, let's say if you have some powder material, you first spread a layer of powder, and then after that, you use inkjet to jet a liquid binder. So once the binder reaches the powder, it's going to penetrate and wick the powder bed, and it's going to spread both laterally and also penetrate. So let's say if you put a particular pattern, right? So powder, inkjet the binder to glue the powder together, and then after that, you can move down the build plate. So you move the platform down, and then you coat another layer of powder on top. And then you can repeat this process. So you coat another layer of powder, you inkjet again, you keep on doing until you have the 3D object. So this is the binder jet printing, and we have been using this for pharmaceutical and food applications. The driver for using for pharmaceutical is, one is like you think about personalized medicine or precision medicine. The idea is that if you look at many of the patients, many times they have to take a lot of, pills, right, or tablets, and for different things, right? That person may have, multiple issues like high blood pressure, maybe combining with diabetes and other things. And then you probably have seen those like pill box, right, with a lot of, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so on and so forth. And then each box, then you put a lot of different colors, different tablets, different pills in there, right? And then sometimes, when you get older, it's hard to remember if you have taken a drug or not. And also, like, some people don't want to swallow so many pills a day, right? So the idea of this is, if we can directly print the tablet, then we can customize the tablet based on the dose, based on what kind of drugs we want to put in there. They call it polypill in the pharmaceutical industry. So you can kind of almost like do the formulation on demand, and then you can use it for customization, right? So then, I can have my own samples of drugs that are printed for me that would be good for me, like, and then it already has all the ingredients that I need. So I only have to take one tablet, not like many. And so that's the driver. And I would say the near-term goal also for the pharmaceutical industry, you can think of this almost like a prototyping approach, but for clinical trials. So you can also print, smaller batches. You don't have to fire up the tableted machine. So it's quite handy that you have a printer, just print, and then it will print, for example, the drug dose, different drug dose, and then you can use it for animal clinical trials. And the other beautiful thing about 3D printing is that because you can change the digital design. So what you can do for those who may have a background or may in chemical engineering, that's the mass transfer problem, right? So let's say if you have a tablet, right, or a pill, and then imagine that you can change digitally each element, each voxel, like what is the local composition. By doing that, it will also change how the drug is going to be released, right? So let's say I can have two drugs, and then they're kind of in a concentric way. So I have drug A, drug B, drug A, drug B, and assume that you shove it in water, right, or above a solution, and then it would kind of start evolving. Then you will release one drug first, and then another drug, and one drug, and then it would have more complex release profile. That would be very hard to do, like, with conventional method. So being able to change the digital design also gives you more handle, like in terms of controlling the release profile for drug. And then the last thing here is like, I think this was, I gave a talk at one of the pharmaceutical companies. And then because at that time we were also making some kind of like chocolate and stuff. And then they say, well, that would be nice because our pediatric, medicine could use some of that to encourage the children to take the medication. Anyway, so let's say if we were to do some binder jet printing, now you know what it is. And for pharmaceutical applications, one of the first things that we want to do is, especially if you have a new formulation that you have no idea whether or not it's going to work, is do some kind of anchoratization. This is a dimensional script called Anson number. You can think of it as like dimensionless viscosity. So the higher this number, that means it's very viscous relative to the surface tension. And in the inkjet process, you're playing the game of surface forces versus inertia versus viscous forces. So by calculating the Anson number empirically, there's a certain range would give you a good jetting, a consistent jetting. But let's say if this Anson number, as I mentioned, is a dimensionless viscosity. If it's too low, then what happens is you kind of form a lot of tiny drops. It's almost like spraying. It's not like coming out very consistently. It's kind of like spraying all over the place. And fundamentally, that's because of the electrolyte stability. But today, I don't think we have a lot of time to cover that. But conversely, if the viscosity is too high, it's also problematic because you don't have enough energy to jet the material. So this is usually a good, if you look at a lot of literature in inkjet, this is usually a good starting point. Let's say if you create an ink, you measure the viscosity, you measure the surface tension, you measure the density, you know the nozzle diameter, then you can calculate this number, and then to give you a sense how far off you are from this magic regime 0.1 to 1. This is done empirically. And so that's a good check, right? So then you can like look at, for example, back then we look at a series of different inks and then different concentration, different polymers incorporated, and then you can do this calculation, and then you can map out essentially what would be the workable zone for your material. And then you can take that ink and then try to put it in print head and do more careful calibration and jetting experiments. But it doesn't account for things like elasticity, which could be important as a rheologist. That could be very important at high frequency, but it's ignoring that. And then it's also not directly dealing with the fact that some of these inks are non-Newtonians, not non-Newtonian fluids. So meaning that the viscosity is a function of shear rate as well. But nevertheless, you can do some of this as a kind of like a first screening of materials. And then you can also do powder keratization. And this is work that typically in the pharmaceutical industry, they handle a lot of powder. And what you see here, VisiJet is a commercial powder. It's calcium sulfate hemihydrate that they use, or gypsum is called, like that they use for binder jet printing, non-pharmaceutical applications. And then you can measure, for example, the density of your powder, both the bulk density, also the tap density, meaning that you apply normal force and measure the density. And from there, you can calculate an index called CAR index. So the lower the index, that means it has better flowability. So you can see this commercial sample by them manipulating the particle shape and size distribution. They have very good flowability because again, the smaller the CAR index, the better the flowability. And then if you look at some some of these samples, like, we have some other formulations that we kind of try to adjust, and the mixture actually is better. So this is kind of the mixture of some 3 components and compared to the original the basic component. So again, this is giving you a sense, okay, if I have a new application, I need to work with new powder, you may want to do a little bit of this, and then so that you get a sense of how well your material could be spread based on this benchmarking against existing materials. Then this is a slide just showing that this the actual print process in action. So this is a commercial printer. It costs about $50,000 from 3D Systems. It used to be called C-Core machines, but 3D Systems bought them. By the way, there's a lot of changeover and merging and all that in the 3D printing space because it's still a high growth area. And if you look here, again, this is just having the powder spread, and then you can see the bar comes in, and then, then you can see probably the inkjet head that's moving. And then we keep on, doing the binder jet process. And then you can go from digital design like this. And you see a lot of Yukon and Huskies, not surprisingly, Husky is our mascot, right, for the sports team. And then so we can convert something from a digital design to various design. It's very flexible. You don't need to change the mold or anything. You just change the digital design. If you have the right formulation, you can print. And this is what I was talking about earlier, right? So by doing this digitally, you can also change the design so that you can have these concentric spheres. Like you can see, like I pretend that the orange color is one drug, the blue is another drug. So you can do sectioning, right? So you can do A, B, A, B. And then by the time this release, also it will come out alternating sequence. So that's the beauty of doing printing for pharmaceutical. And then after 2 years, we learned how to play with that commercial machine and hijack the machine essentially. Then we built our own machine. So this is called Husky Jet, and there's a YouTube. I'm not going to play it here, but there's a YouTube video for this Husky Jet. But this is a tool that is about 7 feet long. It's much bigger in person than in the picture. And it comes with all the bells and whistles and all these systems, which I'm going to highlight a little bit. So it comes with the inkjet print heads, obviously, and then it comes with UV curing capability, infrared capabilities. And we have 3 industrial print heads here. These are high throughput print heads. You see that like these are pretty much mounts fixed because they're too heavy to move around. So this you can use this kind of print heads for high throughput roll-to-roll processing, for example. And then the first test that we did was like, we take this and then we have a drop washer system so we can put in some different materials. And this was a small project that we did on printing dielectric ink on various flexible substrate for the Nix Flex Institute. And then you can put down silver ink and different patterns like to make like passive circuit elements and things like that. This is an animation I'm just going to show quickly. So the Husky Jet could be operated in the binder jet mode as well. And now hopefully you know what binder jet is. So this is just zooming in, let me mute this. So there are 2 powder chambers. This is the feed and this is the build. The one that is closer to this view is the build. And then what happens is we are moving actually the build and the feed beds, and then the powder is being pushed from the feed to the build. And then we can control how much feed material by raising how much we raise the first platform and how much we move down the second platform. And after that, the whole unit moves under the inkjet print heads. And then you can see the inks are coming down. So there's inks coming down and then it's kind of gluing the powder together. And this is kind of like an animation showing like how the ink droplets impinge the powder, and then you have some spreading and then you have some penetration as well. And then you can do, again, this is Husky. So sorry for the hassle, but this is a Yukon machine. So, and then you can put down different colors. We have 3 print heads, so we can put down up to three colors, 3 different materials. And then this process is being repeated. So you kind of keep going back and forth, back and forth. You do powder spreading, inject, powder spreading, inject, so on and so forth. So then you can make the whole husky. This is the husky jet. And then in reality, not the metaverse, in the reality, this is how it works. So it's kind of like in the animation. So we're spreading the powder using this roller mechanism by moving the whole build platform. And then we have some process parameters that we can control. And then we can make the parts, 3D parts. And we use it for making pharmaceutical tablets again. And because now we build our machine, so we have full control in terms of the process parameters. One important parameter that you want to consider is, let's say you have the powder, you jet down some ink, is how much binder is penetrating in the powder bed. Because let's say the blue here, the blue color here indicates the thickness of that, how much binder is wetting the powder bed. And imagine that if you doesn't wet too much, and then if you spread a lot of powder on top, then when you print the second layer, this would be a disconnect between the first layer and the second layer. And this samples is going to be very weak. It tends to delaminate. And theoretically, you can have one, right? Meaning that the thickness of the penetration is comparable to the how much powder you roll on top before you print the second layer. And in case 3, basically you can tune this. I call this degree of overlap. So essentially, the higher this value, meaning that you have more liquid binder per powder ratio. And you can see a beautiful linear regression here that you can see how strong your tablets here depends on this process parameter. And we also benchmark our work against other people's work. But by being able to control all these process parameters, we were able to make fastest integrating tablets that disintegrate in 10 seconds and yet have reasonable breaking force. So the commercial tablets, we're talking about 10 to 15 kilogram force. So here, we are definitely ballpark, reaching the commercial ones. Now, since I don't have a lot of time left, I'm gonna just, talk a little bit about the food. Some of the food printing work is still ongoing, but then the big goal there is to explore 2 things. One is the tunable texture. So by changing the formulation or by changing the digital design, what kind of sensory, what kind of texture that we can create for the sensory for food. The other angle is really has to do with the person's nutrition. So again, if depend on the genetic profile of the person, physical activity, the clinical history and dietary preference of the individual, you want to, whether or not we can additively print the food that would tailor for that person. And we picked the binder jet printing. There are a couple of reasons, like it's very suitable for making low moisture product, and also like it doesn't have to formulate a paste, which could be problematic. And sometimes you can not formulate a paste that is printable. So with binder jet, you don't have this problem because you're dealing with the powder and the ink separately. But there are also challenges. How do you figure out how to jet the ink, how to make sure that you spread the powder successfully, and also the right binding between the powder and the binder. So this is work done, supported by USDA, NIFA, and also Shape 3D, and also our collaborators, the US Army Soldier Center, the Combat Fitting Directorate. And one thing that we, get a little bit more sophisticated, in addition to calculate the Anson number, the dimensions viscosity, we also set up the drop watcher system, and then we can do some experiments and map out under what condition for this particular ink formulation, then we have a consistent jetting zone. So these are 2 process parameters in the piezoelectric inkjet print heads, and then you can just treat them as process parameter 1 and process parameter 2 by doing various experiments. Then you can actually map out what would be the condition to successfully jet the material, and in addition to just knowing the Anson number or the dimensionless viscosity. And then we also did some collaborative work with Anton Parr. So they have a shear cell that you can look at powder rheology. And then by looking at 2 samples, like one is with the additive, you can actually correlate by looking at the intercept here in the Moore column diagram, you can correlate it back to how flowable and how nice the spread layer is. So that could be a good tool. And then we also build other tools because we have our own Husky Jet. So in here, we build a camera system so we can actually do a topology mapping. So after you print each layer, we can actually take an image, and then you can then do some kind of, process optimization on the fly or quality control. And this is, I would like to spend a little bit more time talking about this one. So this is where we start collaborating with the computer science and engineering department and Chin Yang's group. So what we do is like, there's a lot of machine learning and interest in that area, and there are different tools in the toolbox that you can pick and to solve problems. But here is an example. So let's say if you have, you want to print this structure, and let's say if I have a camera, and that can look at what I just printed. And this is a real camera image from the sample. So you can see, for example, I have some defects here, right? So there's some lines that are defective because I have the missing black lines. This is what I want to print. This is what I have now. And then what the machine learning code allowed us to do is to identify where the defects are. Of course, we can improve the accuracy here a little bit more. And then, but once you know where you have the missing dots, and then you can try to come back and repair it, right? So you can actually repair that, and then you check again and say, okay, now it looks pretty good. Again, there's some work to be done in improving the accuracy of the defect detection part. But this is the proof of concept that you can take a camera image, and then you make sure during the print process, if you have any defects, depending on the application, if the two defects is too big and you don't want to start over again, right? Then you can think about this kind of corrective action that you can salvage your part that you're printing. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just be brief here. This is kind of like bringing home the message of like, you can change the digital design. So this is some candies, some sugar candies. And so the blue core is actually with a formulation so that the sugar is plasticized. So it's kind of soft and gluey, but then the red part is actually very hard. So then you have this kind of core shell structures. By manipulating how big a core relative to shell, then you can engineer the over texture of that. So you have some kind of like texture like for these candies, and then you can manipulate that by the formulation and also by the digital design. That's something that we did for fun. So with the candies, the other USDA project that we got funding and collaborate with DEFCON Soldier Center on is the idea of personalized nutrition. So let's say you have soldiers that with different calories requirements depending on the activity, and then you will want to send the information together with like what kind of nutrients that person may be deficient in to a printer, and then you can print it and then have a drone deliver it, right? So that would be one idea how you can do and why you want to do 3D printing for personalized nutrition. But with the USDA, we're also interested in like if it's take some kind of plant proteins, then how can you make it print that? And we have to overcome quite a bit of challenge in terms of formulation and process optimization using all the tools that I just mentioned. And then to go from something that is really crappy here, we cannot print anything, to something that's really nice, and we can make it to different shapes. We can change the density and so on and so forth. This is the last slide, but what kind of properties we get. So this is kind of funny. So so you see on this scale, so there are two things that we look at. One is modulus, the other is strength. You can look at other things as well, like toughness, so on and so forth. But here, this is benchmarking what we can print with the sugar and then the protein powder against something like meat sticks and like bread, MRE bread, and like pumpkin and kiwi and carrot and things like that. So again, this is kind of showing that like we can actually achieve quite wide range of properties by manipulating the formulation and or the process conditions. So with that, I think I'm gonna close because I believe I have overwhelmed you with a lot of information. But the key thing here is like rheology is important, and then also like I think if you ask me what's the next thing and the direction that we're heading towards is kind of having kind of this kind of printers with all this integrated in situ metrology, and also bring in some of the tools like for machine learning so that it can be smarter, and whether or not like the Husky Jet would be smart enough. So we're building a brain for the Husky Jet so that it would be smart enough. The dream for me at this point is to have something like an autonomous 3D printer. That's something that we're working on. I'm not ready to share what we are doing yet, but the imagine that it's kind of like autonomous vehicle, but in a 3D printing sense, right? So as an end user of the technology, you just go to the lab, put the materials in there, you walk away, go to the beach and come back, everything will be done, right? And then the machine is going to tell you what to do. So only if you can trust the machine. So that's one lesson learned. from us. Anyway, with that, I'm gonna close, but I'll be happy to answer questions, and these are the sponsors, so I'll definitely acknowledge them for supporting the work. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Anson. I think let's open the floor to questions. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. Let's try to keep this going quickly. I think Ankit, you had the first question, followed by Bruno, and then we'll have more questions.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the great talk, Anson. Very fascinating to see the range of materials that you can really print. So the question I have is related to the densification. So is there a way by which you can sort of dial in the densification at the time of manufacturing rather than resorting to post-annealing treatments?
So you mean like, so let's say, is there a particular print method that you're thinking about, like extrusion?
No, I'm thinking about the binder jetting, where if there is something you can do to, say, for example, change, I don't know. I mean, some process control that can be adopted to dial in the densification in these products.
Yeah, so actually that's a good question, because a lot of things that what I show here, and it's the actual print process, right? But the post processing is actually sometimes even more involved than the actual print process. For example, like in a binder jet, typically you're making parts with a porosity of like 40 to 70% porosity. So being able to densify that, I think it's important if you're looking to get rid of the air trapped, or so there are a couple of ways that you can do it. One is that I know like in binder jet, a lot of people, they do like some kind of infiltration with another resin after you print. That's one way that you do. But I think if you want to integrate it and do it directly at line or online, one thing that you can play with is like maybe you can pick a certain binder, and then the amount of binder that you can jet down could be higher. So then, and hopefully, that would be denser. Or if you want thinking about applications like ceramic kind of green parts materials, what you can do, you can explore the idea of having some nanoparticle dispersions. Maybe like, so imagine that you have the big ceramic particles that would be the structural powder that you're trying to print. And then you can introduce some tiny nanoparticles when you sinter that, right? So then they would, because you have a higher density now because you have all these tiny nanoparticles that are sitting in between the big particles. Right. That may be one way to kind of have a denser product at the end. Right. But binder jet tends to be, you're right, like binder jet tends to be more porous and, compared to other techniques like extrusion base or full polymerization base. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I have another connected question related to the binder jetting and densification. So I'm going on the other side now, the flip side of it, where, for example, I may be interested in drugs that in terms of controlled release would also mean the release rate. So in order to enhance the release rate, I would want to have a nanoporous drug. So that means I'm looking at a porosity, which is sort of a certain length scale, say 1 nanometers or 2 nanometers. So is there like a technique by which this can be achieved? So we are looking at tuning the porosity and not the densification.
Yeah, so yes, that's also a great question. The one that I showed here is the fast disintegrating. But actually what we actually recently have done with the sponsorship from the company is like we now can make sustained release. And what you do is actually in the formulation, you have something in the powder that could swell, like so space filling. It poses some print challenge because sometimes samples just swap because like it swell too much. Like you really have to adjust the process parameters, but you can actually mix things. Imagine that it's a composite, but then as let's say if you have a component in the powder that will swell when it's exposed to the binder, then you can actually fill that space. So then it's kind of like, then when the drug is released, it's actually through the gel matrix pretty much. And then, but you have to go back, and in our case, we actually had to reformulate that because otherwise the one that we show, it just falls apart very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bruno?
Hello, Anson. Thank you for your talk. We have a 3D printing center here at ASU, so all the things you're talking about are so relevant. So I have a couple of technical questions more about the extrusion and of the high loadings composites. And so couple of questions are more related to, first is, what is the operating shear rates of your nozzles?
Mhm.
And as you sort of crank up the loadings to the physical limits, can you predict, or have you seen situations where there's wall slippage of the composite on the inner walls of your nozzle?
So I would say for the printer that we previously used for that carbon composite, we estimate a shear rate to be on the order of 10 reciprocals or so. That's the wall shear rate. 10 to 20 reciprocal second. And obviously it's a function of volumetric flow rate, right? So it's 4Q divided by pi r to power 3, and then the radius. And then the second question is an excellent one as well. Like, so definitely, if you ask me, there's definitely a slip. And then the slip is a shear stress dependent also, right? So usually the harder you push, and this is something that, even not the printer, if you think about like people use capillary-rheometer, I mean, this is all this, Mooney's correction for the slip and all that, like it's been studied, and one could potentially do something like that. Or I think definitely that it slips. And then also it slips, why it slips is a more interesting question also, right? So I think one hypothesis is that like you have the particles cannot impinge and penetrate the wall, right? So then you may have a layer of liquid, with a low viscosity locally, then it kind of slips, right? But the harder you push, the higher the shear stress, you run into that slippage issue, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because you have the rheometer data, and in theory, we should be able to see wall slippage. The last data point on the right-hand side of shear rate is actually the onset of, some slippage that can happen even in the rheometer, right? So it's interesting because the surfaces, we did a paper where the surface finish of the rheometer was the same surface finish of our nozzle, cool. To try to predict from the rheology data when there's wall slippage, because that seems to be in the very high loadings, high pressures, high Qs, but it's always hard to know what the actual shear rate is. And I know there's one really nice paper that just came out, like there's like an X-ray video of the nozzle. And then folks are trying to visualize that, but it's nice to hear. It's the different set of materials that I'm working on, but it's really nice to see that you also are concerned about this and some of this.
Yeah, and one easy test that you can do, so there's some correction like that. So Robert Prudhomme's group that many years ago, what you do, let's say if you do a parallel plate setup, like, and then you can try the gap size, right? Because if you see there's a gap size dependency on your viscosity data, then you can try to do some, correction for the slip and figure out how much slip that you have. Because if there's no slip, then your viscosity data should be independent of the gap, right? But when you have slip, then it would be a function of the gap size. So that usually is a telltale sign that you have some slip. And no matter how hard you try using serrated plate or sandpaper, whatnot, like a lot of things slips.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great question, Bruno. I appreciate it.
Sahid, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Unmute yourself. Sahid, you're on mute.
Okay. So this is Said from Nigeria. So it's a very good presentation. I really learned a lot. So my question is, what is the significance of the contact angle that was discussed earlier? I mean, the significance of the contact angle.
Yeah, so I would say the contact angle is important because typically you are printing on a substrate. So the contact angle is essentially determines how wide that ink is going to spread, right? So typically if you have a low contact angle, that means it like to wet the surface more, right? And then ultimately, then it in turns determine the print resolution. And this is especially true for inkjet inks, because inkjet inks, they tend to be low viscosity. So a lot of times, if you don't have fast enough solvent evaporation, the final footprint is being determined by like essentially the contact angle, the equilibrium contact angle of the ink is making. So it has impacts on the resolution. And also adhesion, right? If you think about that, right? So of course you can say, okay, I want to make this and I want to make it as fine as possible. But then the caveat to that is now like, the contact angle is high, but it could be so high first. If you do an inkjet process, imagine that you're shooting water against like a water jet against wax, it's gonna bounce right off, right? So you're not depositing material. And let's say if you're lucky enough so that it will still adhere, but if the contact angle is too high, also the contact area between the ink and the substrate is gonna be small. That means it doesn't take much to peel. Right. So the contact angle has implications in terms of like the resolution, the print resolution. I would say also the adhesion. There's could be some trade-off there, and also like whether or not you can successfully deposit materials onto this surface.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Thanks, Sahid. Anyone else? Otherwise, I think Anson, I have Pierre, you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question about the printing of medication. I would assume that typically the raw material would be quite expensive. And so the inkjet binding, especially if you're mixing several components that you might not necessarily be able to recover, seems to be, it would be an expensive process. Is there something I'm missing or?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the most expensive usually is the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the drug. And here you have a choice here. Either you blend it with the powder, but then if you do that, then it's very difficult to change, for example, the local drug concentration. And then there's all this question about if you were to recycle the powder and print again, then how uniform the drug distribution is. So a better way to do that is actually you can put it via the inkjet head. And then so basically like you're only jetting down the most expensive material with the inkjet head, and then you're just doing tiny bit of material. And then for the outer powder, it's just the excipients that is to non-active, like that to make up the volume of the drug tablets. But definitely there were discussion about like people like whatever powder that is not bound, like how comfortable you are, how close can you recover, and so that it's not going to accumulate and have all this quality control issue. We have not looked at the recycling of the powder, but like I would say one way to overcome what you mentioned is the more precious one could go in through the inkjet head, and then the powder is cheap, like those lactose monohydrate is relatively cheap material.
So it would be sort of a hybrid between jet binding and inkjet printing, kind of?
Yeah, so and then it's where the key thing is where you introduce the most expensive ingredient. So instead of introducing in the powder, I would try to introduce in the liquid ink, because you only print where you need, right? So and in fact that has been used for some proteins that are very expensive also, like then that's why they want to do inkjets, because then they can only jet to areas that they need it, and then the rest of the area is doesn't have that. And in this case, then you don't worry too much about wasting of materials, because the most expensive material is only landing where you need it to be. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking.
Anson, just a very quick question. In your magnets that you made, with the plots of coercivity versus remanence, and you showed that the importance of having a bimodal, distribution versus a mono or a unimodal. But for the same volume, you showed that you obtained better, performance with the bimodal, right? But I would assume that the density is probably different too. I mean, one's probably.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly. It's in the paper that there's a table with the density, but the density, because your magnetic particles is heavier, right?
Yeah.
Polymer, so definitely that you can see that. And then by doing the bimodal, if I remember correctly, the density is actually getting close to the injection molded or the molded sample, so it's quite dense. So even in the print, we don't apply actively a lot of compaction pressure, but it's quite dense. But yeah, definitely, like as you change that, you can also see the density goes out. Like
Okay.
as you
But, and I probably missed that. Maybe it's just a nuance, but in your successive build layers, right? Do you actually vary the distribution, particle size distribution, or it's just you just begin with the source of powder and you don't modify?
we don't modify it, and that actually sometimes, like depending on the sauce, like especially for natural products, is a nightmare, right? Because like depending on the harvest, you have different,
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And sometimes my student, like, and also during the transportation, you may have some segregation, and then sometimes we just run it through a very coarse like sieve, and then just have it take out the major chunks, because otherwise those would be the defect points when we print. But other than that, we're not doing any active like mixing of particle size and things like that. So we haven't tried the rheology trick that we use, the powder. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Anson.